Welcome everybody. You're here with me, Bridget Romains, for the Mobile Expert Interview series. Mobile Relocation runs relocation programs for corporates and also private clients to enable that people can have a smooth transition into New Zealand. Of course, that's a pretty big piece moving internationally and involves a lot of different levels of expertise, as are those of you who've brought expats into New Zealand before will know already. Particularly for employers and businesses who are really desperate to get international talent into the country at the moment, immigration is one of the biggest hurdles that people face. So today I have asked Rachael Mason from Neave to come and share her expertise on an area of immigration which didn't exist prior to COVID, but is now top of mind for many employers. So welcome, Rachael.
Thanks, Bridget. Good to be here.
Yes, I'll just give you a little bit of background on Rachael before we start. Rachael has many years' experience. She's an immigration lawyer and a partner with Neave. She's worked with employers and also corporate clients, providing both transactional and strategic immigration advice to them. Since COVID hit, she's developed a particular niche in what we now know as border exceptions, which are the only way to get international talent into New Zealand. In particular, she has been very successful in the critical purpose category, for which she has a near perfect record of success, which is something to be said. There are certain categories such as construction and health workers where it's a little bit more straightforward, but the other critical worker category really is quite complex. So glad to have you here, Rachel, and looking forward to hearing your gems of wisdom. Before we dive into the specifics, can you set the scene by telling us which companies, which types of businesses have been successful in getting these visas and the overall success rate that businesses are looking at?
Sure. Well, like you've already mentioned, I guess since the COVID-19 and the border closure and the border exceptions became a thing, which was around June, July, August last year, it's fair to say I've pretty much lived and breathed them. And made numerous applications. I think probably getting up close around 100 individual applications now, so getting up there. And that's just me. Our team obviously does them too. So across the team, we've pretty much been there, done that. And the good news is that we are seeing successful applications across a really wide variety of industry sectors. So I wouldn't say if certain industries it's not possible. We've seen them far and wide. So everything from construction and engineering, pharma, startups, major listed New Zealand companies. Particularly, we've seen international companies who are seconding people down here for their assignments, consultants coming in on business visits for particular technology, things like that from offshore. And what I like to call the chiefs, so all your chief information, chief executive, chief operating, we've seen lots of those sorts of ones come through. And then a lot of technicians, so technicians or engineers that are going to come in and service or perhaps install. It could be health equipment, manufacturing equipment, even some jets. We've had some experts come in to fix some jets. So all sorts of things. And in relation to your question about success rate, well, I don't want to jinx it, but it's actually I'm sitting on 100 at the moment. And there's some really good reasons for that. Firstly, I think as we've lived and breathed it, we've got a really good handle on what's required to get one of these over the line. And I do have to say it's not always been the first time. So we're on 100, but not always first time success. Some of them we've had to battle and have a couple of goes at. And I'm waiting on a few just right now. And I was thinking it's going to be typical that just, this morning a decline comes through, just so I'd have to confess it. But, it's always good to be pushing the boundary. So there's certainly been some where we've said, look, not sure. And the client will just say, look, we would actually rather try, you help us put our best foot forward and we fail than not try and not know. But we want to do everything we can to get this person in. So we're always happy to work in that way. So yeah, so far so good, but it has not been an easy journey, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just getting into the detail a bit more now, what are the criteria for getting a border exception? It's not like getting a talent visa or, the visas that we were used to pre-COVID, is it?
No, it's not. But I think we've been able to, we all like to use that word pivot. And I guess our firm has been able to pivot into this fairly readily because some of the arguments that you make in a border exception are similar to some arguments that we make in some other more complex cases. Not so much your typical Talon visa, but some of the things around character waivers and things like that. They're similar kind of approach, I guess. So there's a number of different categories, but today we're focusing in on that other critical worker. So, and that's, I guess it's the catch-all. If you're not a healthcare worker where you've got your own exception, or certain other classes that have their own exceptions, this is your catch-all category. And there are three, I break it down into three kind of categories that you would need to get home on, one of three types of areas. So the first is that the person has unique skills, technical knowledge, or experience that is not readily obtainable in New Zealand. Not readily obtainable being an important phrase. The second is that they are working on a time-critical project and in a key role for a government-approved major infrastructure project or government-to-government agreement or other government-approved programs. So there's actually lists of what these are, but you think they're major sporting events or major infrastructure, massive roading projects. There is a list of those. Mm-hmm. And then the last is that the person is in a time-critical role for work which will bring significant economic benefit to the national or regional economy. And in that one, the example we would look to is when they brought in, right near the beginning of this exceptions process, they opened the borders for Avatar and some other film crews. And the feedback from the government around that time was that collectively that was going to create 3,000 New Zealand jobs. So that gives you a bit of an idea of where the bar might sit in terms of significant economic benefit. It's pretty high. So most of the cases that we've done have been based around that first criteria, the not readily obtainable skill set. And I just thought it might be useful to break that down a little bit. Firstly, not readily obtainable does not mean we did a labour market test and we just couldn't find a person, we couldn't find a Kiwi, so we'd like to bring this person in, please. We also need to prove the time criticality of the role, and time criticality is defined as being that if this person doesn't come, then the project or the work will either cease, be severely disrupted, or significant costs will be incurred. So that's something to think about. You also need to prove in the application that there is no viable workaround solution and that the role can't be done offshore. So if it looks like this role could be done by the sort of 2IC person, or that it can be done remotely, then that will make things very difficult. And you also need to be able to demonstrate, if you're coming for more than 6 months, you need your person to be earning at least 106,000. So less than 6 months, for example, I mentioned sort of some of the technicians and things, they might not be on 106, that's okay because they're only coming in for a short space of time, but that acts as a bit of a indicator of skill, perhaps, that if we're going to be bringing people in on a longer term basis, we'd expect them to be earning up around those higher salary thresholds.
Can I just ask you to clarify, it sounds like quite a lot of work and thought goes into that piece around justifying why the person is important to the organisation and the wider economy. Do you guide businesses in how to do that?
Yes, we definitely do. I think this has really been refined over time. So in the early days, we were trying to find out where the bar sat. And that's why I said earlier, where we haven't got them over the line first time, that still happens sometimes, but not as much. It happened more in the early days where we were trying to find a feel, and probably INZ were too, for how this policy actually should be interpreted. But yes, we definitely guide them through it. And like I said, it's not readily obtainable is actually defined. So it's not just couldn't find a Kiwi. It needs to be that there is either no pool of candidates in New Zealand with that skill set, or that there's a very limited pool, and I interpret that to mean perhaps a handful, and that they're not available to you as the employer. So it's definitely at the top end, and the decline rate for these is really quite significant. It's a very high bar to meet, but as we all know, the pressure to get into New Zealand is significant. There's a lot of Kiwis wanting to come home too, and so only those most critical workers, there you go, there's the phrase, are allowed in.
Absolutely. So moving now on to the actual process, what do you and the businesses you're working with need to do?
So usually what we do is we sit down and we started out with a really detailed brainstorming session where we look to understand as much as we can, what's going to be our strategy, what are going to be the key arguments that we're going to need to demonstrate to INZ to prove that it's a skill set that's not readily obtainable here in New Zealand, and we work through that. And as you've probably guessed, it's not a straightforward process, but it's broken down into two chunks. So there are two key parts to the process. The first is the border exception request. So meeting those criteria that I spoke around, that it is time critical, there's no workaround, etc. And then if that border exception request is approved, and that is definitely the really hard work to get that part. If that's approved, then you're not home and host, but the much easier part is to follow. So you get issued with an invitation to apply either for a critical purpose visitor visa, or for if the person has an existing valid visa. So they might have been a person that already had a 3-year visa and just got stuck offshore. If they're in that situation, they can apply to have that visa varied to allow them entry, because at the moment that visa doesn't work unless it's got special conditions varied on it to allow them to enter the country. So stage 1 is the border exception, and then stage 2 is the critical purpose visit visa or variation of their existing visa. And at that critical purpose visit visa stage, that also includes the dependent family members. So they're nominated, any partner and children, immediate family, are nominated in the border exception. But it's worth noting that that doesn't have any impact. If you do or don't include the children and the partner, that won't impact the likelihood of success. Because a lot of clients have asked me, oh, do you think if we just say there's just the one of them rather than bringing the family of 5, that would increase our chances? And that doesn't have an impact on whether you'll be successful. So I think that's really good to know. But at the critical purpose visa stage, the family are included. And if that next stage is successful, then the main applicant will get a visit visa with work conditions, so they can start work as soon as they're in the country. The children and the partner will just get visitor visa conditions. So that means the partner can't work initially, and the students have only very limited access to school. So you want to fix that when you're onshore pretty quickly. They get usually 9 months to enter, which is quite generous. It used to be 6, but 9's even better without the demand on MIQ. So even though you've said it's a really critical purpose, they still get time to wrap up their affairs at home and make the plan to actually move down here. So they've got time to do that and time to find an MIQ space. And the visit visa process, it's fairly light touch. So it actually doesn't dive as deep as perhaps a talent or a work visa application would. They just want to demonstrate, they're just looking at the high level stuff. Are you a genuine applicant? High level health and character assessment, but there is another more detailed assessment to follow in a later visa application.
Yeah, so getting that border exception is the most difficult part.
That is definitely the big hurdle. If you can do that, I think that's, for us, that's the bit where we sigh a big sigh of relief, really, that's the major hurdle accomplished.
And the border exception has to be applied for by the employer on behalf of the employee. There's no ability for an employer to say to someone that they're talking to overseas, you just go off and get yourself a border exception. That's
right. Yeah, they and the amount of work that goes into it and the amount of detail that goes into it, it would be impossible for an applicant to do this without the employer's support. You just wouldn't be able to demonstrate tell a story enough, I think, to be able to do that anyway. But yeah, it's definitely employer led.
Right, which is a change from the previous situation pre-COVID.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. So what happens when they've arrived in New Zealand? You mentioned that it takes some time, I guess, to get the children transferred onto visas that they can use to go to school, and for the spouse to get a work visa, but it does happen. Are there any other things that they need to be aware of once they land?
Yeah, so because they're only on it might be a 6 or a 12-month visitor visa, they will not have access to our public health system. And although many of these people will have private health care anyway, that's just something to be aware of, together with the fact that you've got potentially long processing delays on a visa application, and you've also got the situation where the partner and kids can't access work and studies easily. And so for that reason, we always recommend that they apply for their normal visa, which would be a talent or an essential skills, usually work visa, as soon as possible after they arrive, just so that they can get those wheels in motion immediately. So Frequently, we have actually prepared that and quite literally lodge it the day they arrive in country. So they'll text us and let us know they're in MIQ, and then we send it off. We just don't want to lose any time getting those in, because you've got some important things waiting on it. But just jumping back, because there's no access to public healthcare, we also always recommend that people coming in make sure they have got medical insurance, just to cover the first few months of their time here.
Yeah, no, that's a good tip for employers and duty of care too, isn't it? Now, this sounds quite detailed, and it sounds like there are many more steps in the process than there have ever been before. Is it a costly process? And if it is costly, why do employers do it?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say it's a pretty pricey process. There's a lot that goes into it. And I think when you understand the amount of time, effort, and financial cost that's involved, you can easily see why it is expensive, not just from a dollar perspective. Just by way of indication, I guess a typical request that we would prepare would probably have 5 to 10 pages of written submissions, which have been really carefully whittled down to hit the key marks, together with a carefully curated bundle of supporting documents to help demonstrate that the criteria are met. And then by the time, so a lot of work, and by the time you factor in so you've got the legal fees for the border exception request and the critical purpose visa, you've got the INZ fees for both, you've got flights, MIQ, which starts for the first applicant at around 5,000, and you are, as an employer, obligated to cover that cost. So you actually have to tick a declaration to say, yes, we agree to cover those costs. You can easily see how that adds up, and just at a guess, I'd say you won't be getting a lot of change from probably around $20,000 as a starting point, depending how complex and how much the flights are and those sorts of things. And why do employers still do that? Consistently, we've seen, I guess this has actually been what's been quite rewarding about the work, is that the risk of not is significant, much more significant than that cost. And so if you've got, for example, you're launching a major new product, or you're launching a new IT system, you just can't afford not to have the right person there to make sure it all goes smoothly. And if that's a person that's been involved in that project a long time, then you want to have them on the ground here. And I guess in other examples we've seen, it's been something like a major product launch, or your company is going through something quite significant in a transformation type phase. And again, you need the people that have got that proprietary knowledge, the history, and the leverage within the business to be able to help you on that journey. And so again, it's the cost of this is just a small fraction of the potential upside or downside to our client. Yeah. So that they're more than happy to incur it, and especially if they can get the result they need.
Yeah, so the business case is more long-term for the business rather than the short-term upfront cost of getting the person.
Yes, yeah. And I think that the costs, in a way, they are probably helpful, because they do act as a bit of a barrier to entry, insofar as an employer will genuinely try everything they can, try all the workarounds, and only be willing to do this if they really need to. So that's probably quite an appropriate barrier, because before you go spending a fortune, you are really going to try and see if you can make it work before you go diving into this. And as I said, it's not just the financial cost, it's quite a time commitment to pull the paperwork together.
Absolutely. So what are some of the common pitfalls and risks around entering into this process, if a business is evaluating whether it's something that they want to do?
The most common risk or pitfall, I think, that we have seen, actually, and I'm going to blame INZ for this, is employers trying to do it themselves. And that's because the website just makes this look so simple, just leads to an online form which has some boxes to populate. So I can totally understand how an employer would read the skills aren't really obtainable. Yes, that's our person. Those skills are not available to us in New Zealand. We'll fill in that form, and then they get a bit of a shock when it's declined. And so that's probably the most common pitfall that we have experienced, is employers having to go themselves, and as I say, down to the slightly misleading, I don't think it's intentional, but just that it appears much more simple than it really is. But some of the other pitfalls that we've seen, a common one is around that $106,000 threshold. So you can only, if someone is earning, let's say they're earning 95,000, we've seen quite a few employers that weren't aware and haven't understood how that 106 works. So have put in an application either for a 12-month and beyond critical purpose visa, or they've put in an application just for 6 months, but haven't clocked that they already previously lodged to INZ a talent visa application that got frozen in the system. So INZ knows that you wanted to bring this person in long term and they want a permanent employment offer, but now you've told us you just want them for 6 months, and that doesn't stack up, and so that will get declined. And it'll probably be suggested, and I've seen this a number of times, that the employer has provided false and misleading information by suggesting that it was only a short term when you've already told us it was a permanent role. So that's one we see quite a bit. So that's definitely something to be aware of. Other pitfalls that we see, particularly around the C-suite roles and around other roles that appear to be desk-based. So those are difficult applications because you've got to convince INZ that there isn't a workaround solution. And if it's a desk-based role, they're going to say, well, you can do that over Zoom. And unlike me, manufacturing a product that I've got to craft with my hands, I can actually have Zoom meetings and phone calls for some of those roles. So those can be quite tricky to do. So yeah, demonstrating that there's a viable workaround is pretty important. And then probably the other big one is just not articulating the case in a compelling way and in a way that INZ can relate to. Like a lot of the applications that I see that the employer has put together, it makes sense to them because it's their business. But they've sort of dived in and perhaps haven't really articulated what is not really obtainable about this person's skill set, and back that up with some good solid supporting information. So yeah, getting that balance, putting enough information in without overwhelming them, I think has also been a common mistake we've seen.
Making it easy for NZIS to be able to tick all their boxes and say yes.
Absolutely, that it really is a bit of a checkbox. Actually, it's a checkbox exercise together with a significant amount of subjective decision making, I think. So they have to be able to tick these certain criteria. So you've got to be able to articulate those. And then there's a definite, what's the sense we're getting here? There's a definite aspect of that.
Interesting. Can you give us or share with us some examples of successful applications you've made for clients?
Yeah, I think without trying to, I don't want to give enough detail that I can share my clients' details, but I can certainly give you some of the themes. So, and it's been so interesting actually this week. It's been super rewarding because if you have to get to the level where you convince INZ that this is going to have a significant impact for the New Zealand economy, locally or nationally, and that this person's going to make a huge difference, then you've also convinced yourself of that. So it's been, and you know that you are actually helping New Zealand businesses, which are going to transform our economy one business at a time and have a really positive impact. So that part of it's been so rewarding. But some of the really interesting ones I've done one for, and actually we did this one together, so you'll recognise it, for a government department. And so government departments also need to apply for border exceptions. That's something to note. They don't get an easy run just because they're government. But they had, pre-COVID, they had done an offshore recruitment campaign. They had 5 experts coming in across their business, so not just into one team, but all different experts across their business. And they had all been offered. They all either had secured their visa or had applied and were just waiting. And some of them just hadn't got on the plane yet. And then COVID hit, the border closed, and those people were locked out. And so the organisation actually started them all remotely, started them all working, and they'd been working for a number of months in that way, hoping that the borders would open. This was in 2020, but as things evolved, it became clear that that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. And so at that point, we were instructed to help them with a border exception request for the 5 of them. So it is possible to do a group application for more than one applicant at a time. And in this case in particular, they all had different skill sets. And so you have to demonstrate that each of those skill sets is not readily obtainable in New Zealand, but we also could tie that back to an organisation-wide time critical reason that the group of them needed to be here. And so, yeah, we were successfully able to get that application, and there's a lot of logistics, which you were heavily involved in, Bridget, of bringing people from, they were in Turkey, they were in Canada, South Africa, Japan, so all over the show. And but they're all now in country, and we're now in the process. Most of them have now transitioned in the process of that next visa, so to actually get them on their talent visa, and then they're good to go once they've landed. So that was a really interesting one. Another very interesting one is I've helped a celebrity chef. So twice actually, done 2 border exceptions for the same chef. He was coming in to open a restaurant, and so I wasn't sure this one would actually fly, but he's actually is a very well-known chef, not just a head chef or an executive chef. But yeah, we brought him in initially for the restaurant opening, and then we did a second one for the America's Cup. So around the time of the America's Cup, we were able to bring that person back in again. So that was also an interesting one, and a completely different flavour from a government department. But yeah, I guess it gives you an idea of the breadth. The other example that I'll share is, and this is probably, I think, very common across all of the applications that we do, and that's where there's an industry that might be quite small or emerging in New Zealand. So oil and gas, for example, it's quite a small industry here. And so we've brought in oil and gas experts, and we can say, look, this is a small industry, it's a niche industry, and there's this project, which is a new project, and we need this sort of skills. We've got a very small market, and we haven't done that type of work here in New Zealand before. And then we can argue to bring those people in. So you can see how that could translate to other sectors, other industry sectors. If it's a new innovation, or if it's something that's well established overseas, but we haven't done here in New Zealand in quite that way, then you can start to demonstrate, well, that's why these skills aren't obtainable here, because we haven't done that here yet. So that's probably another good example.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Yeah, that sort of degree of specialisation and uniqueness is something that you can help to highlight, I guess, for this. So I don't know whether there's anything else you want to add, Rachel, but I'm just wondering whether you could give us some details of your contacts in case people want to follow up to talk to you, really. I suppose the first step is to have a conversation to find out whether you think it's viable for a particular business to be applying for these border exceptions. I know I have sent people to you in the past on that basis, and that you're very honest and pragmatic with them. There's no benefit to giving people false hope where it doesn't exist. So yeah, how can people contact you?
Yeah, people can contact me over LinkedIn, email me directly, give me a call. My details are on the Lane Neave website, and they'll be obviously attached at the bottom of when we broadcast this. You'll be able to find me linked to this broadcast anyway, but you're most welcome to get in touch. And yeah, I will always give an honest opinion. I'm very happy to have an initial chat. If you're thinking about making one, or if you've made one and it got declined and you wonder if that could be successfully turned around, then happily have an exploratory call and just see whether we will give you our honest view. To be honest, there's no value in me not being honest, because well, firstly, I've got a good record. I don't want to damage that. But secondly, you know, we want to set the expectations at the right level. So we want to either you go into it knowing that it's only a slim chance, but you still want to give it that shot, or we think it's a good chance, but there's always a risk. There's very rarely are there slam dunks, I've noticed, in the border exceptions. The only ones that are more secure are the technician installery type ones, because they're actually specially mentioned as an example of what might be unique skills not readily obtainable. So they tend to be easier to do. But other than that, yeah, it's never a certainty. So very happy to have a chat. And as I say, feel free to reach out if you've got questions, or if you're putting one together and you want a review of it, we're happy to do that too.
Right, thank you. Well, thank you for being our latest mobile expert to interview, Rachel. I think that's been fascinating, and I'm sure there are many of our people in our network who are working in either HR or recruitment who will take some valuable information away from our conversation today. So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.